Hello, everyone, and welcome to the College of Architecture and Design's Church Lecture Series. My name is Christopher Cote. I'm a graphic design professor here in the School of Design. And tonight I have the privilege of introducing Ari Munciano. Ari is a designer, creative technologist, artist, founder of Afrotectopia, and lecturer at New York University and Pratt Institute. Munciano's work explores how various forms of design impact the human experience and how to create artistic environments that cultivate curiosity and imagination. Tonight, in her lecture titled Electromedia, Design Fluidity, and Black Radical Imagination, she will describe her electromedia practice, omni-specialized design research, and pedagogical approach to design in speculating and building futures that are ecologically centered, equitable, and pluralistic. She will share her research on Indigenous and Afrocentric practices and technologies, Afrocentric pedagogical designs, and the intersectional and imaginative community building process, Afrotectopia. Tonight, viewers are welcome to submit any questions during the presentation in the Q&A feature, and we will save them for the Q&A at the end. So welcome, Ari.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. Let me share my screen. Okay, so hello all. Thank you for joining. And I'm excited to share some work and research that I've done around the ideas of electromedia, design fluidity, and Black radical imagination. And so I can start by giving some context. Christopher did a great job of elaborating on my bio, but also to give some personal context. The way that I even approach any of this work is by my rooting and upbringing as an artist. That was the first thing I ever identified myself as someone that just loves to create with whatever is around me, and found design and creative technology to be excellent tools in expanding the possibilities of art, where design allowing me to make sure that I'm creating things that are intentional for other people, other beings that are interacting with the work, and creative technology, creating space for the art that I'm creating to not be a monologue within communities, but that it creates a dialogue where other people can see, other people can create with what I've created. And research constantly impacts my work of being able to learn about new topics and then find places to put them in within my art practice. I'm an educator, so teach courses at NYU and Pratt Institute, all relation to design, technology, and society. And in being an educator, I feel like I'm constantly able to be a student, which is my favorite part of being an educator, is that I'm in a classroom and I get to learn from what my students are creating and the ways that they're thinking about the work. So I'll break this presentation up by first giving an introduction to my personal electromedia practice, and then how that then influenced my research, and then how that then influenced my pedagogical studies and work in relation to pedagogy, and then how that then influenced building Afrotectopia. So my electromedia practice began as I mentioned, of someone that just loves to create art and create with art. And always, in growing up, always had an inkling that technology was a perfect pair with art, and that it allowed for newer possibilities where fine art, or what people might call fine art, like paintings or sculpture, were great tools for self-expression. But I felt like combining technologies and the possibilities of electromedia could create new worlds and really be a fascinating combination. So I dived pretty deep into art and technology in graduate school. And in that time, as someone that one of my favorite areas in creative technology, or one of my favorite areas in general within art, is music and sound. And so I had been thinking about sculptures, and sculptures are kind of, for me, these miniature forms of architecture, where they're basically the way that one of the ways that I enjoy architecture so much is that it creates spaces for the mind to explore. It's not just about housing people, but it's also about housing an entire experience. And so, and then not having access, obviously, to architecture and building these full out spaces, but sculptures being kind of these micro versions, like maybe even a microcosm of an architectural landscape. And enjoying the way that architecture could be this visual language, but also not wanting it to be something purely aesthetic. A lot of my work is thinking about aesthetics in relation to some sort of utility, and not purely being this being to look at. And so my form of utility was exploring, how can I create these sound sculptures to be something that is a tool and allows people to form new ways of engaging with technology. And I mean, not with technology, but with sound, a new way, a new user experience, UX design, as people might call it, with sound engagement. So I would develop these sound sculptures where I'm infusing technology into these different sculptures. And so that as you touch the different parts of the technology, like a soft ribbon potentiometer or a regular potentiometer or a photo transistor that's detecting how much light is coming into that cell, it then distorts and changes the sound. So as I move my cell phone's light up and down, that's then changing how much light is being captured. And then that then changes the amplitude or the frequency of the sound. So really considering how can I design new experiences for people to engage with sound. And this was during a time where I was in graduate school and I was in a course called New Interfaces for Musical Expression. And one of my favorite parts about this class was that it allowed me to, the final project for this class was to create an entire experience around the work that you're developing. And so we were merely tasked with creating an instrument of our own that has a new way of interacting with it. And that was it. But I wanted to go even further and live perform with it. But I wanted to go even further, create an entire experience for people to immerse themselves in as they're hearing the sounds that I'm developing. I also wanted to create visuals. So I created video art to be projected behind me, created a costume for me to wear, and really thinking about this entire experience of how, and making it as multisensorial as possible. So I started off by creating my first instrument, which was, as I've labeled, a neo-retro guitar. So it's kind of new, but it's also based off of an analog design or project. And so with this guitar, I was also watching Jimi Hendrix's movie, a movie about Jimi Hendrix at the time, and I'm just in awe of like the coolness of Jimi Hendrix, the way that he looked on stage with the guitar, and wanted to reimagine that in my own context. And so creating this guitar, and then also using a variety of different digital fabrication tools like the laser cutter and a bunch of different sensors like arcade buttons and linear potentiometers. And so a new way of, beyond using strings, using sensors to then control and distort what sounds are being played. And also created a beat machine, which is a pretty typical machine that we use all the time, but thinking of new ways to control this beat machine. So not just being a bunch of pads, buttons on pads, but also, again, with the linear and circular potentiometers and, you know, different material like iridescent acrylic material. And all of it being developed with an Arduino and some, you know, wires and resistors, and then presenting the work. So performing with the work. And so the space itself was a hyper multisensorial experience of, for me, thinking about me really wanting to sit myself as the mirror of Black culture and the beauty of Black culture. So bringing in different clips on a variety of different facets of Black culture, along with sound. So a highly experimental compilation of sounds being distorted and mastered together. And then again, the costume and the overall aesthetic of all the instruments, and creating all of that and seeing what would happen. And so I've continued this sort of work because for me, I found it's a really great way to engage in pedagogy. It's an experimental form of pedagogy. So as opposed to creating an entire presentation on facets of Black culture or critical race theory, it's more of, I'm putting you inside of this really experimental but immersive space that's multisensorial, so visuals and sounds. And then you're able to learn and gain some sort of paradigm development and understanding, you know, different facets of Black culture. So in this instance, I was performing at a different space, and instead of using machines that I had developed, at least for this performance, other times I am building my own sound machines and then we'll use them in performance too. But for this one, just using a variety of different sound machines that I have and loading in a bunch of sounds and mixing and distorting sounds, and then creating this on the spot performance where you have all these different facets of Black culture, a bunch of source media from YouTube, and then also hearing excerpts from people like James Baldwin or Stokely Carmichael, where it's this both yesterday, today, and potentially new of this idea of Black life. And the new being, as you see, these 3D rendered characters that I've developed on the right side of the screen, where for me, I'm often thinking about how media literally creates cultures and the perception of culture. And media has done an excellent job of, you know, creating this idea of what Black culture is or what Black people are, just like these stigmas and stereotypes. And so me using that to create my own explanation of what Black culture is and what that means, and creating a new context for it. And so doing that by literally 3D rendering characters in the way that it feels like media is rendering this idea of what our culture is. And so continuing along this vein again of an exploration of Black life and culture, and what does that mean, and whose gaze is being amplified as far as the culture. And for me, obviously, I'm coming from a Black woman's gaze or Afro-Latin gaze, but taking a step back and also looking at the other gaze is like the white gaze and what that does to different cultural artifacts, or the ways that allows people to interpret the different cultural artifacts. And so for this one, I was thinking about my personal love for Black cultural artifacts like do-rags and bamboo earrings and Afro picks, and thinking of how can I recontextualize these artifacts, because when they are worn on Black bodies, or when they're shown in their normal context, they're seen as something that has a negative stereotype or stigma, and can seen as something that's associated with poverty or ghetto life. But for me, I'm looking at these artifacts as something that are truly beautiful, historical, and they have such expansive stories within them, and they remind me of my upbringing and what people that I grew up with wore. And there's pieces that, they have a lot of sentimental value for me. So how can I recontextualize these pieces to get away from the ways that white gaze has interpreted them to be, but to create a future of Black culture artifacts and create sculptures that, remove the way that we currently interpret them as. And so recontextualizing them through the use of art, through sculpture, and, compiling them together, but also by infusing technology into them to then create new realities of what might, Black culture be in the future, and how might you be able to engage with them. And so in this instance, I've infused technology where as you touch the different artifacts, like the bamboo earrings or the hair rollers or the do-rag, new sound is being produced. And I would live perform with these sound sculptures where as I touched, the do-rag in 1 second and the bamboo in another, I would create these sonic scapes, all based on African drum pattern music, but, these live performed music. And so even as you touch the hair, and hair is a particularly interesting thing to have a relationship with, and to create an experience where someone is touching hair, because when you touch Black people's hair, it can often be something that's very offensive. You always need, from one, permission to ever do that, because not doing that, when people decide to, take on their own agency and not ask a Black person if they can touch their hair, or any person really, but it happens often to Black people, it's very degrading, and it can seem as if you find them as if they're some sort of exotic being or an animal. So it's always important to ask permission to touch a Black person's hair specifically, but then to create an experience around not having to ask, because there's no person to ask, but instead it's an installation. And then flipping it of putting technology into this, as you touch it, you're then hearing these new sounds. So kind of creating this myth or mystical experience of it's the fact that there's magic behind these Black culture artifacts that make them so secretive and unpermissible to just touch, and creating a new experience around what if it's actually not insulting, but maybe it's because there's magic in these elements that you're not able to engage with them. So creating a new reality. And as we touch the Afro picks and change the Afro picks, there's a sort of pseudo DNA within the Afro picks. And I made it so that as you place a different Afro pick on this bed that I also fabricated, it would then change the projection that you see on the wall. Another work that I created in relation to race, but more thinking away from the glorifications and aesthetics of race, but thinking about critical race theory and how to create an experience that allows people to learn of a new perspective when it comes to race and understanding critical race theory. So with this one, I was thinking a lot about how when we navigate through life, and I'm thinking particularly in the US, when you're walking down the street and you see something happening in a public space, depending on your upbringing, depending on your race, socioeconomic status, et cetera, you can easily have a very different interpretation of what happened versus someone that's staying next to you of an entirely different lived experience. And so I was exploring how can I recreate that experience in an exhibition? And it started with me sitting in my living room. And on one side of my living room, I had these lights that would change colors in a cycle, in a loop. And on the other side of my living room, I had artwork hanging up on the wall, and my art has a lot of different colors. And so watching how the color in the room changed the artwork, the way that it looked, because if a green light is shining on orange paper, it changes the color completely versus if a red light is shining on orange paper. So being really enamored by this relationship between light and color. And so wanting to recreate that experience, but in a way where it can reveal certain texts and hide certain texts, or reveal generally something and hide something else. And so I used that and created a new technology just simply with lenses and color and graphic design, where I bought a few different glasses and then I changed the color of their lens to specific colors. And I had these different glasses all representing different ideologies or perspectives. So one pair of glasses is representing the perspective of someone that is of an oppressed community. So someone that's probably someone of color, or maybe someone of a sexuality that's not heterosexual. And then another pair of glasses that's of a person of an oppressed, a person. Another pair of glasses would represent an oppressor's perspective. And then another pair of glasses would represent someone that thinks they understand what racism is, but isn't entirely aware, honestly, of the construction of racism and how it all works. So that might be someone that considers themselves like a neoliberal or something, where they say things like, oh, I'm colorblind, which, you know, they're attempting to do good, but they don't entirely understand how it all works. And so as you look at these different micro sentences that I have on the graphics that are easy to read, like racism is good, which can easily be a controversial, micro statement, but really it's understanding that this isn't the complete statement, and that depending on the pair of glasses that you have worn, you're going to see a very different interpretation of what racism is good might say. And so with the different pair of glasses, say you're wearing a pair of glasses of someone that's of an oppressed community, you'll see what will be revealed to you is text beneath racism is good that says racism is good for my oppression. And if you wear a pair of glasses of someone that's of thinks that racism is bad, but doesn't entirely understand, on top, you would see what would be revealed to you is, I don't think racism is good, and so on and so forth. And so the way that people are even introduced to this experience is through a turntable. And I'm a DJ, and I study a lot of different aspects of culture, club culture, and those sorts of things. And one thing I think a lot about, especially being a DJ, and then, seeing how people kind of come into this DJ world, is how so many Black culture artifacts, so many technologies and things that have been built within specifically Black culture are immediately extrapolated from the origins, political origins, social context, or commodified quickly without any homage or respect to the Black creators, and those sorts of things, and how, it's a great tool for capitalism, and where it just exploits and takes, but doesn't recognize or respect. And I feel like a turntable is a perfect example of that relationship and cycle. And so created my own turntable using alluring, colorful, iridescent material and fun, light colored patterns, and made it so that as people they just were approaching this turntable, not understanding what experience they're going to be placed into. But for me, I felt like, what would it be like if before people could engage with any Black cultural artifacts, that they first had to learn the social context and racial origins and political origins of it all. And so with this one, I infused that first part of the project of using glasses to represent different perspectives, and then made that a part of this entire experience, where it's a whole experience of you engage with something that's of a Black origin. And as you use it, what you're experiencing as you're turning these vinyls, computer vision is observing where the vinyl, what direction, what placement the vinyl is in, and then that'll change the video that you're seeing or what you're hearing. And so you see here on the bottom right, a man turning the vinyl and seeing different footage in relation to critical race theory. Above him, a picture of a screenshot of Solange Knowles and Don't Touch My Hair, a music video very tied to this work. And then if I keep going, you'll see people that are standing right next to each other that have entirely different experiences based on the glasses that they're wearing. So, synonymous or representative of how we're moving through life with entirely different interpretations while standing right next to each other. A more recent project that I developed was called Metamorphosis. And this was, at the sort of climax of the second uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement in March and April, or more like April. And so this was a time where there was a lot of political unrest in the streets, just as there are now, but it was the climax. and a lot more activity going on. And just to constantly hear things like no justice, no peace, or I can't breathe, which are really cathartic and therapeutic things to say in unity with a group of people as you're protesting against such a violent system, but also recognizing and having conversations with people that are saying, you know, us constantly saying things like no justice, no peace, or I can't breathe become affirmations. And affirmations are when you continuously say something, they start manifesting themselves. So what are we doing to ourselves if we're constantly saying no justice, no peace? Can we not have peace because other people are not providing us justice, you know, taking back our agency? Or also, I can't breathe. We want to live this life of where we can't breathe. No, we can breathe. So wanting to take a step back and think about the things that we're doing and the ways that we are challenging these social orders that are very violent and oppressive towards us, and realizing our agency as we're dealing with them. And so for me, I was personally thinking a lot about the effects of turmoil and pain on the body, of what does it do when we are constantly being existing in such violent social orders and oppressive systems. What does that do to our body currently in the life that we live in now, but also what has been passed down onto us ancestrally, of all the experiences that our ancestors have had. And I'm thinking particularly about people of the Pan-African diaspora, of us really still dealing with the pain that our ancestors dealt with in chattel slavery and other forms of oppression. And so thinking about this, and which is called epigenetics, which is the change of our DNA based on experience. It's an alteration of our genetic code. And so wanting to create a reversal of the epigenetics that we have dealt with all these centuries, but creating a reversal of it where it's a positive epigenetics through healing modalities. And so this required, as I mentioned before, a lot of my work stems from research, such as the critical race theory work. Research affected the past project, this one being studying sound and color and the ways that those can be tools for healing. So I was studying different frequencies that are aligned to different 7 core energy centers. And if you're of the Eastern spiritual practices, they're called chakras. And I had also known about African drums, whether it's African drum pattern music or African drum instrumentation like djembes or talking drums, which have historically been used in revolutions, especially in Pan-African revolutions like the Haitian Revolution, and djembes were tools, and talking drums were tools for different communities to communicate with one another, or one community to communicate with everyone else that was inside that community in a way where at the time, for the example, the Haitian Revolution, how slave masters, they couldn't understand what people were saying with these drums. And it was a way of, communicating in secret. And so, but also drum pattern music is something that's, again, ingrained in our DNA of our relationship with it. So what if I was exploring, what if I could create a culturally specific, so Pan-African healing modality that was accessible online and that was using sound and color to create a positive epigenetic experience. And so, as I mentioned, is doing a lot of research. What's the relationship between sound and the different energy centers, and finding that each energy center had their own sound frequency tied specifically to that. And then there's also the solfeggio notes of how different frequencies then do different things, are expected to do different things to our body. And then also African drum pattern music and studying that, and drum instrumentation. So then infuse all together and create these sonic landscapes. But also I study a lot of psychogeography. And so for those that are, studying architecture, understanding how different spaces impact the way that you move, the way that you feel when you're in a space of curved walls, allow people to feel more calm versus rigid, angular walls. And so wanting to bring that in the space of making sure that the dynamic, the navigation and passage that people are engaging with within this space is something that's continuing along this healing kind of environment. And so, as I mentioned, a lot of my work fuses sound. I do a lot with sound as an artist, a sound designer, and also a music producer. And so using a variety of different machines like my modular synthesizer or other synthesizers or beat machines to then create these sonic landscapes. And then design the space. So I built the space, and something I've been thinking a lot about is what is architecture in digital environments. We're often thinking about architecture in physical spaces, but there's a whole new world inside the internet where we can also imagine the way that we can design spaces that exist within the internet. And so building this web VR environment using spatialized sound, so as you get closer and closer to the spheres, and you'll see better at a better angle in a second, you're hearing the sound most loud. And then as you move away from it, you don't hear that previous sound and you start hearing a new sound. And so creating this entire environment, 3D rendering it, and then bringing it to web VR. And I've really enjoyed playing around with web VR because I know VR has been all the rave, especially in the past 5 years, that though it's existed for decades, people are really excited about VR, but I think other people are also pretty annoyed with how exclusive VR is and that it doesn't allow everyone to really enter the space. You have to pay hundreds of dollars for a VR headset. But with web VR, you can use a lot of the same possibilities, but make it purely accessible in the web. Someone enters a URL and now you're inside of this VR environment. So have been tapping a lot of that and thinking about architecture in these virtual spaces. And so as you see the spheres, and using a lot of circular design, as I mentioned before, psychogeography, wanting this to be a therapeutic and healing space. And as you get closer to those different colored spheres, like the red one or the orange one following or the yellow one, those hold all the sound within them. And so as you move closer and further away, that's controlling the volume of the sound. And how each section is then also specific to each chakra. So immediately you enter the root chakra, and then following that's the sacral. But a lot of my work is thinking about modular synthesizers. I mean, a lot of my sound work, I love using this machine because for anyone that has ever engaged with one, the way that you actually create your own modular synthesizer. Usually you can buy some that are already assembled and you can use it however the assembler has, oriented you to use it, but you can also create your own entire modular synthesizer sets. And I've loved being able to build my own, but really interesting about it is that each of the components are called Euroracks. And the way that I use my modular synthesizer is very much in a polyrhythmic sort of way. Like I'm often designing different rhythms and they're all playing at the same time, which is a polyrhythmic orientation of music. And polyrhythmic is something very inherent of African drum pattern music. Usually when you have African drums music, it is of a polyrhythmic, multiple rhythms going on at the same time. And so to use this machine where it calls its components Euroracks, but then to develop African drum pattern music has been a really interesting relationship for me to explore. And one thing that I've been exploring with it is I often also observe how you can find it a lot on TikTok, or just how dances become really popular and are put on YouTube of there seems to be this unified experience of you hear a certain sound and there's this really unique dance move that goes along with it that sometimes people can do it without even ever having seen that someone did it before. So there's something about the relationship between sound and the way that we move our body that has been really interesting for me in exploring. And one way that I've been doing that is in a current residency that I have with New York Live Arts. As their first creative technology resident. So it's a space where it's usually dancers and performers that are holding residencies in the space, but they've been thinking about, what does technology have to do with dance and movement? And my exploration with that is creating an application or, a tool that allows me to observe people's relationship, their bodily movements in relationship to different sounds that I'm developing, and to maybe find and identify, more clear relationships between them. And so I'm going to show you a prototype of that, where I've developed a machine learning algorithm or machine learning based application that identifies, the different limbs of your body, and it can track it and it'll draw lines between them. And in using that, and I'm also pairing it with modular synthesized music that I've developed, again, of an African drum pattern kind of style. And for right now, I'm just using it on myself and observing how do I move in relation to the sound. And one thing that I noticed after having danced and then watched the video is seeing that as the sound gets higher, my body seems to move higher. And as the sound gets lower, my body moves lower. And so the next steps for me are to publicly release this and be able to capture all the ways that other people are moving and observe what are their tendencies between sound and their movements. So that's more of the electromedia practice. And then I'm going to breeze through the research and pedagogy and then finally get to Afrotopia. And with research and pedagogy, a lot of my studies engages with pedagogy in general. And one of the foundational readings that I've loved is Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is also heavily influential to Bell Hook's work on teaching to transgress. And both of them successfully challenge the current educational model that we have now, where we, teachers consider students as basically empty containers, where you kind of put all the things that you find as a teacher important into it, and you make it as if the student needs to find the same amount of importance. And it's just a very, it can be a very oppressive kind of order in a classroom, as opposed to thinking of education as a way where it's giving students the tool to challenge social orders, challenge status quos, but also really just to realize their own agency. And I think classrooms really need to be evaluated, or just the educational model needs to be evaluated, where it allows for more agency of the student and takes the teacher away from center stage and really creates this, circular kind of and more lateral learning environment. Other areas that I've been very interested in are indigenism, as was mentioned in the talk's description, and also natural orders and natural social orders, kind of with the Hidden Life of Trees, which does a really great job of expounding on the ways that the infrastructure of natural systems like trees, and considering things like mycelium inside of tree roots, and these sorts of things operating as a sort of intercommunal network infrastructure, similar to the internet of trees, working together to make sure that the trees of the same species, they have what they need, and just the different ways that they communicate with one another. And you'll see some of these research pop into other things that I'm going to share. But a lot of my work is also, I found a lot of similarity between just my interest in a lot of different topics with Stuart Brandt and Stuart Brandt's development of a Whole Earth Catalog, which Steve Jobs has called as basically the early version of Google, decades before Google even existed. As Stuart Brandt was very interested in almanacs, and just like this compilation of a variety of different information in one space. And this was at the time of the Vietnam War, when a lot of Stuart Brandt's friends were moving off the grid because of their differences politically with what the state was doing, what the US was doing. And Stuart Brandt wanted to create a catalog that allow people that are living off the grid, quote unquote, off the grid, to still be able to be self-sufficient and to self-educate. And so this catalog being a tool for that, if you learned a lot about really very interesting topics like cybernetics and computing, but also how to build your own house, how to create a microfarm, and those sorts of things. And then Victor Papanek is also very influential to me in that Victor thinks a lot about design in a very intentional way of how can we think about design in an ecological framework? How can we think about the ways that we communicate with each other in design? How can we think about other people that we're designing with and for? And so others being, these are examples of other work from Victor Papanek of how everything is connected. And so this really spoke to me of oftentimes I'm engaging with things that are spanning a lot of different ideas, spanning a lot of different topics, but to find other people, and often told, you need to, kind of in our educational model, we're often told you need to think specifically about one area. You are a geography student, so only think about geography. You are a sociology student, so only think about, a specific group of people. But really realizing that all of these things are connected together, and that we don't need to separate and silo. And this is what the Whole Earth Catalog looks like on its front cover. Another area of research that I've been really excited to discover over the summer has been African Fractals by Ron Eglash, who is spent a lot of time on the continent of Africa, doing a lot of research on different ways that communities across the continent have used math in such prolific ways, in ways that when European invaders and settlers were arriving on the continent and looking at the people of Africa, with a lot of disgust and looking at them as if they're below species, how really the things that they were doing as an African people were way ahead of what these European people were observing. And they would see things like African people, scattered about in different areas and without much organization. And that's how they would look at the urban settlements. But really, the way that these groups of people around the continent of Africa, what they were actually doing is have fractalized urban design, where it wasn't about these Euclidean structures of, north, south, east, west, and straight line streets, but it was more of it was a relation to power. So you have the chief and you have the closest people to the chief and then the closest people to those chief, and it kind of continued to fractalize in that way. And how fractal maths weren't something that were purely intuitive or accidental of the people on the continent, but that it was very intentional, and it was understanding all of these different powers in math and how you could create really efficient systems. More recently, this summer, I've been exploring information theory in general, and as I mentioned before, I'm thinking a lot about the internet as a sort of experience beyond purely utilitarian, but how can we really reimagine the internet, especially in us being in the midst of quarantine and us using the internet a lot more than we did before, especially to communicate with one another. So I was awarded a fellowship through I-Beam, which is a art and technology residency kind of space based in New York City, where we were thinking specifically about surveillance capitalism. And for me, when I was thinking about surveillance capitalism, I was thinking about how can we evade surveillance capitalism's opportunity and ability to prescribe information to us based on our behavioral data. So what would it be like if we could spontaneously learn things in the ways that we were able to do in the early age internet, where it didn't know you so well, didn't know that you were really interested in football, it didn't know that you love to go hiking every summer, and it, filtered you a bunch of information in relation to that, but it had no idea what you were interested in. And so in that, you were able to come across a lot of different information that you would have never guessed. And it also didn't put you in these sort of political and social echo chambers, but you were just allowed to explore. And so I wanted to create an internet experience, internet that was about experience, driven by the philosophies and structures of biomimicry. What does the internet look like that's biomimicratic, that operates in the same way that natural systems do? How can we think very critically about the way that we're communicating with each other and the way that information is being cycled to us and shared with other people? And as I mentioned before, I'm really thinking a lot about digital architecture and digital psychogeography of how can we create spaces that are thinking about, the design of spaces, and not just here's a hyperlink to go to this website, but instead here's a portal that allows you to lead into a new part of the internet. And so in that, I did even more research, both revisited past research that I had already done, but also engaging in newer research. So past research being Places of the Heart, which is a really excellent read on psychogeography, again, studying pedagogy, because this is about information and sharing. A lot of it is about pedagogy. A lot of my work in general is pedagogy and experimental forms of it. Of African fractals, how can we think about different ways to design and create radical indigenism, so to learn about different communities. Hidden Life of Trees, me studying the ways that trees are connected with each other. Ijama villages in Tanzania, so understanding different economic models and social orders, like the social experiment of Tanzania, where they're creating these forms of socialism, and club culture and Whole Earth Field Guide, and politics of design, and so on. And so really trying to create a space that further reveals how everything is fluid and connected with one another, similar to this illustration by Victor Papanek. Victor Papanek is a big champion of how everything is interconnected. And also of the same vein of this quote that I have found that is from the Whole Earth Catalog, or from a writer of the Whole Earth Catalog, where it says, the only humane and effective way to break the negative grip of antique culture is with information. So thinking a lot about, these echo chambers, political echo chambers that we exist in, how it's so rare that we'll find perspectives that are different from our own, and how we can just, exist in our own realities because we're only fed information that's related to our, idea of what our reality is, but how we can really break that and advance society and humanity by this exposition of newer information and different information that's outside of our current scope and paradigms. And as mentioned earlier, of this architecture of environments, of digital environments, so creating these spaces, creating the infrastructure that would exist inside these digital spaces, and then using a lot of the elements that I use inside of the Metamorphosis project, like spatialized sound and interactive media, to create this space. So this is all a prototype of the space. And then another prototype being, so these spirally lines are portals. And so the idea is, as you enter this virtual space and enter these portals, they then lead you into these experimental kind of environments that bridge gaps between things that are often siloed. So one portal might lead you to an environment that's considering quantum mechanics in relation to sound design, or another portal leads you into an environment that's thinking about environment in relation to Dadaism. Two things that would probably never really be in the same sentence, but what would it look like? What would information look like that's expanding on these ideas, both of these ideas in tandem? And in this time, I was researching, sharing a lot of research on, my personal omni-specialized design practice of me being very adamant about not, tying all of my work into one specific area, but really understanding the full picture and the way that a lot of facets of life work and their relationship to each other. And when presenting, I'll give a quick synopsis of the work that I was sharing in omni-specialized design for Beautiful Futures. I was often start with this quote by Benjamin Bratton, who's a theorist and philosopher, saying that the job of design in the 21st century is to undo much of the design of the 20th. So understanding that the work that we are doing today, we should often challenge, what has been done before, of that it's challengeable. And I think something that's really been great about this time, this current, variety of different uprisings that have existed, specifically in the States and even beyond, is that we are challenging the status quo. We're realizing that if what is existing in the world today is not working for us, that it's something that we can change and we can make it healthier and better for us. And I think it's really important for us to understand our own agency and changing the ways that we are living, and making sure that the people that are in quote unquote power understand that, it's not a siloed power, it's a unified and collective power. And so understanding that design, the practices of design were human, man-made, so they are inherently flawed, and we can question the way that we are designing and really create design practices that are healthier for all. And so this area of research that I was developing was really questioning the role of a designer, what principles are we building design off of, and ways to design. And for me, it was important to expand on the role of a designer, because we often think that the designer is like this visionary or this, sole genius, but really a designer, their sole role from the beginning is to be this bridge. Victor Papanek uses this language often in his work of the designer is a bridge between people of many different disciplines, a historian or a scientist or an engineer, a community member, an artist. And that's their strength. That's their number one strength, is making assembling an interdisciplinary team. Because when you're designing with very siloed practices, you're going to have blind spots because you don't have people that are familiar with that kind of understanding of the world. So number one is making a bridge. And I think oftentimes, and even beyond the bridge, something that Victor Papanek also says is when you're designing, the most important person in the design team is the person, Victor uses the language, the user of the system or product. I try not to use the language of user, because it's something that's very traditional of talk in technology, of like a user experience designer or a user interface designer. But I think the terminology of user can often flatten the dimensionality of the quote unquote user, of their humanity and a variety of different, factors within them. And it's really about making sure that we are very specific to who we are suggesting. And for me, terms that I replace with user is a beneficiary who is receiving, who is gaining from this product or system. And so Victor, elaborates on how the quote unquote user is the most important person. And I think this is a really important philosophy for all design practices to gain, especially with things like architecture and the built environment, as we often think, we're the designer, we've been educated at these prestigious programs, and, we know a lot, so we can enter these spaces with our savior complex hats on and think that we're doing these different communities a favor by entering their space and designing and bringing all of our cultures into the space, and often not really respecting the cultures that exist within that space, and thinking that, especially in an academic framework, which is, especially in a North American academic framework, which is inherently a very white space, there's this often a very faulty way of approaching design, where we think that whiteness is neutral, and that the cultures and the ideas that we're bringing in are neutral ideas, and really they're white ideas, and we have to respect and understand that before we enter spaces that are not white, and assume that our way of being is whatever way of being that's rooted in these sort of white European, Eurocentric practices are something that everyone else should be engaging with as well. So just generally understanding that the person that's benefiting from this system, from this product, from the service is the most important, that they're the expert within their experience, within their community, and so on. And we really have to respect that. And Julia Watson expands on this idea of the mythology of technology, which I feel like is also very inherent of design. And these sort of philosophies that really started to develop after the European Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, it was all about capital, capital, capital. And in that, technology started to create this, started to find itself more at the root of, or at the core of humanism, colonialism, and racism, which inherently produced capitalism. And so we think we have been taught to think that technology is built off of the foundation of these ideas of humanism and colonialism, but really technology is built off of indigenous innovation, ancestral intelligence, and local wisdom. It's the practice that indigenous communities have done forever, for centuries, for decades, and the work that they've been doing, especially with the land and all the things that they developed over time, and their intelligence of the land in ways that we can never, as non-indigenous people that have been so severed from indigenous practices, could never understand, because it takes centuries to understand. So that's where the role of technology is, and technology is not, the synonymous idea of hyper-productivity and capitalism. And so all of that, of that being, an example of my research practice, of it, thinking a lot about a lot of different areas, have all heavily influenced the classes and courses that I develop and then teach. So The Revolution Will Be Digitized is a course that I designed and have taught at NYU in the Interactive Telecommunications program. And me feeling like that's a really important space to teach this class. And I think in general, technology programs really, I think it's criminal if any technology program exists, especially today, that's not thinking very critically about the ethics of technology and how these things are impacting people and where they came from and what their uses are. So this course I've developed where we're thinking in tandem with technology and its uses of it, but also of economics, of surveillance, of the military origins of the internet, of sociology, of public policy, of politics, ecology, design, all of these different ideas that all have had some sort of participation in the development of the technology that we use today, and being reflective of how has technology impacted people in the past, how has public policy created these situations that exist for people currently, and how is technology building off of these past situations and current situations, and then going off and designing these newer realities. Another course that I designed and teach at NYU in the same program, Interactive Telecommunications program, is designing club culture. And this is kind of like a funner, or maybe, a lighter side, or, an artistic side to the technology. The revolution will not be digitized, or revolution will be digitized. Designing club culture has a lot of the same ethos, is studying a lot about technology and race and counterculture, but not with a specific and traditional political lens, but thinking in a way where how is it impacting people in a negative way, but more of how has technology allowed a fuller artistic breadth and a tool of expression with technology, with electromedia in the club culture eras. So this is building off of the archival work from Vytautas Design Museum, where they created a whole collection of archival footage and photographs and all of these sorts of things, and also a whole exhibition on club culture from the 60s to today. And so this course allows students to understand how architecture, how audiovisual technologies, how social justice movements, how counterculture, have race, how artivism, artistic activism, all of these things have been blended together to create these newer realities, how club culture in general were these sort of participatory theaters where people could come and realize a whole new identity and escape a lot of the social oppressive orders that existed outside the confines of the walls of these clubs, and enter these newer utopias through technology and design. And so then in going up and wrapping with Afrotectopia, for me has been a really important project in that it has given me a community and a place to explore all of the things that I think about alone, but with a vibrant group of people that are thinking about these things as well. And so I built Afrotectopia while a graduate student at the program I mentioned a few times, NYU ITP, Interactive Telecommunications Program, for when I loved being a part of the program, a student of it. I loved being introduced to all these different ways that I could merge art and technology in such seamless ways. Like, it wasn't a question of if it's possible. It was always an expectation that yes, it is possible. So I love that. I love being introduced to all these things, but I was very frustrated at the lack of understanding on race and social context in relation to technology, of not having any, very few Black classmates, or not having any Black full-time faculty to look to for any guidance, and just generally not having a community of Black people that I could see and see that they were doing similar work or in the vein of creative technology. So really missing that community and mentor and companionship in general in relation to these sort of practices. And so decided that one way to fulfill that is by creating an environment specifically for this, where it wasn't me being the one Black student in my class raising my hand of, oh, this is not, the experience that other people will have if they don't have access to these certain things, or, my upbringing was very different, or we need to think a lot more critically about how we're, designing this platform. But instead I could be in the midst of a bunch of people that are already thinking about these things, where race is not an add-on to technology and design, but it's inherent in the conversation because it's coming from people that understand and have a social awareness. So told my program about this idea of creating a festival, and immediately got support from the faculty and from classmates, and designed it. And in spring 2018, it sold out. Of a lot of other people were feeling this void as well. And it's continued to be an annual festival. Our second festival was at Google in New York City, where we were continuing to think very critically about the future of Black culture, of where we are today, of ways technology can be potentially, and technology and design can be potentially used as a way to mitigate racial disparities. And it has existed also as a summer camp. So summer 2019, we had a summer camp that developed Afrocentric STEAM curriculum, so students could see themselves in STEAM. Oftentimes the way that STEAM is taught, especially in the US, is it's very whitewashed and Eurocentric. Of it creates this idea that, STEAM and engineering are inherent of the minds of white men, like that if you're white and you're a guy, you can easily understand this. Or, you have better agency because those are that's what, it's a prototypical computer nerd. That's what we identify. That's, the look of it. But really, just as I mentioned with African fractals, like a lot of the work with cybernetics and technology comes from the continent of Africa, of these fractal mathematics. And these are things that are beyond, a cultural scope of, specific to white men, but it's something that's much more expansive. And so if we reframe the educational context that we're teaching STEAM in, a lot more people will see themselves in STEAM and have the agency to explore it and bring in their culture when engaging with it. So beyond the summer camp, which was geared towards 7th through 12th graders, so secondary school students, we had the School of Africtopia, which was geared towards adults. So these are people that are maybe still in college, a lot of them working professionals, and really just being able to be exposed to the ways that you can merge art, design, technology, Black culture, and activism, all the central pillars of Africtopia, in a classroom that's for adults. And so they're entering the space, gaining a variety of new skills. And so after that, in the time that we would have been planning to create a third annual festival, we instead had a imaginary fellowship. So this was a time where we had 10 different fellows from all over the world and country, given $1,000 each to come together for a month and a half, just to ideate and imagine healthier Black futures. And so the fellowship was created because, for one, it was thinking a lot about individualism versus community. And as a professional, creative technologist and creator and innovator, I often do a lot of different residencies. And the form of residencies are, a company or institution or foundation gives you a lump sum of money, and you go off and you build that work in silo completely on your own, and then you return and present the work that you've developed. But for me, I wanted to think a lot more critically about the fellowship model and not make it something where it's individualistic and one person gets to build and create alone, but it's more of a communal practice where you're creating something with a cohort and a group of people collectively and together. And in curating who would be fellows and meeting with every person, most people that were interested. And so having a lot of different interviews with people was I wanted to be very intentional to make sure that the fellows were of people of a variety of different backgrounds, that they weren't just, technologists like computer scientists in a typical way, but a lot of them, had never coded before, or many of them had discomfort with technology and thought of it as a sort of oppressive tool, but were interested in finding a way that Aftertopia was thinking about technology. So the people that were fellows, they were coming from curatorial backgrounds, from geography, from humanities, digital humanities, the game development, 2D, 3D animation, architecture, machine learning, and so forth. So really cultivating an omni-specialization cohort for Black futures. And then also respecting that Blackness is not a monolith. And I think generally this happens with people of, people of color, you have this token Asian American person, you have this token Indian American person, you have this token, Black African American person, and you think that they are a representative of their entire culture, but it's really about leaning into the nuance of this idea of Blackness, which is really a political identity with the race relation. And so when we're thinking about Blackness, this space, Aftertopia, is also very critical of not having, just the US American, the African American that's based in the States, but understanding that, Blackness is not a monolith, and that people of different cultural identities, and these are a list of the cultural identities of the fellows. Some were Haitian, some were Afro-Cuban, Mexican-American, Black, Honduran, West African, Black British, all of these different identities, cultural identities, impacted the way that they saw themselves as a Black person. And so it's important that we had that breadth of understanding of Blackness, and that they're coming from a prismatic collection of perspectives. So really it's about being very careful when you're designing futures. Aftertopia has been very intentional from the beginning for one, it's a technology-oriented space that's welcoming of all. So you don't have to know anything about code. I think with a lot of tech gatherings, whether it's like a conference or a festival, it's geared a lot towards people that are thinking of themselves as traditional technologists, they're computer scientists, and the events are kind of like, what libraries, what softwares are you really good at? But this space it's meant to be none of that. I feel like those spaces are very cold and isolating, but this is meant to be welcoming of all. So we have people that are coming from a variety of different practices, but specifically with the fellowship, we have people that are coming from a variety of different perspectives too. So thinking about sexuality, some people identified as fluid or cisgendered or, non-binary, or even thinking about socioeconomic backgrounds. So some people were of working class while others were of upper class. And all of that, and making sure that we had a representative of a bunch of different perspectives. And rooting Aftertopia in general, and also, making sure that the fellows understood that the way that Aftertopia thinks about technology is that it is merely an extension of human capability, and technology is not synonymous with digitality. Technology does not mean a computer program. Technology is merely just a way to make life a bit easier, and it's developing something, and that becomes a technology. And if we're getting away from this human-centered orientation of the definition, technology merely being an extension of sentient capability. So whatever has life and it has a spirit and the ability to, move and advance and all of those things, it's a sentient being. So understanding that it's not just about humans that have developed technology and as an extension of capability, but it's that every sentient being has explored how can they make their lives a bit easier through technology. And so these were the fellows. Again, they came from all over the country, came from every part of the country. So we had people from Southwest, from the East, from the West Coast, Northeastern, Midwest, everywhere. And we also had fellows from around the world. So UK, Ghana, France, who then moved to Netherlands. And so the objectives were to build a micro community of imaginative innovators, to collaboratively develop healthy Black futures and share all research. And I'm going to wrap up in about 5 minutes after explaining what happened at the fellowship. So in this time, we developed a syllabus, we developed 4 to 5 main projects. We had Imaginariums, and having conversations with a bunch of the people that were interested in being Imaginary Fellows. Really, a lot of what they wanted was just a space to come together and talk with people that looked like them, people that were Black, and people that were, critical of the ways that we were using design and technology, and just create a space where they can, come together and learn and explore and just express themselves. Because oftentimes these people had a similar experience that I did in being in a graduate program or in any collegiate setting, where you're the one few Black people of, everyone else in your class. And so it's really important for us to have spaces to gather. So we had Imaginariums, and this was to make it so that the Imagineers weren't the only ones that were benefiting from the work that they were doing and the research that they were doing, but that we could open up these conversations to the wider Black public. And so the Imaginariums, they would follow along with the research that the Imagineers were doing and the syllabus that they created at the beginning of the fellowship. And the Imaginariums were allowing for anyone that was Black to enter the space to, for one, we started off with a guest presenter like Olivia here talking about technoculture. And then we broke up into small groups where they could, in Zoom, so breakout rooms where they could build intimate conversations and build community amongst each other. And while they're in these small groups, they were able to access the mural board, and it was a collective wider mural board for that week. And so they could enter their thoughts and see what other people outside of their breakout rooms were discussing, even though they were in their small breakout room. So we had a variety of different presenters like Olivia and Olalekan for Designing Future Cities. They broke out into the small groups. And then we ended up with a collective conversation, which allowed people to come together, all of us to come together and talk about all the things that we were thinking about in the past, 30 minutes of our micro conversations. And so, as I mentioned, the goals being to build a vibrant, micro-dimensional, multidimensional Black micro community to contribute and create healthy Black visions of futures. I think oftentimes we're engaging in social justice practices. We're very much about, protest, which is always important. It's always important to challenge these oppressive social orders, but we often are protesting without any vision for what we're fighting for. And so for me, it became really important to use Afrotopia and the community to design these visions so that we as a community can have something to look to as we're fighting. And to develop open source interdisciplinary pedagogy. So all the work that was done inside the fellowship is accessible online. You can, see the syllabus. You can, read whatever readings that the fellows were doing. You can look at the mural boards that the community were doing at the Imaginariums. And the fellowship, we had a variety of different projects. So again, it was a communal practice where all the fellows were collaborating on these specific issues every week. And we built the syllabus that was publicly accessible where everyone could enter and look at the readings that the fellows were doing. And then every week, the fellows would, in the days of the week, they would read the different readings that they all selected were most important. And then we would have conversations on the Sundays where we would gather. And then those conversations would also be done in tandem with having guest presenters. So similar to the Imaginariums, we always had a guest presenter. At the fellowship, we also had other guest presenters. So here we have Raphael Smith, who is design director at IDEO, talking about his work where he every weekend would, sit around on Saturdays in a cafe, read the newspaper, and then create a prototype invention that, would be a solution for something that he read in the newspaper. So one project was solar powered reparations, and he designed the whole infrastructure for what that would be. And then they go into vision mapping and prototyping of, thinking about what's the solution for this week's prompts. And then I would go and translate all the work that they had done into these easily digestible visual language forms, which I would then share on Afrotopia's Instagram so that other people had access to it too. And then the fellows, they wrapped up with writing essays on their overall experience, but also just the research that they had done in all this time. So you can also go onto Afrotopia's webpage and find the variety of different essays that the fellows had written that were, really impactful and inspiring. I mean, one of them was a PhD student and mentioned how going into her PhD program, she was already, pretty depleted and exhausted of just the way that academia can be so designed in a way that it really extracts so much humanity. But in going through this fellowship, she was reinvigorated and exploring, and even, signed up to take a class in architecture or to just explore these different areas and studies that, were completely outside of her scope pre-fellowship. So the overall goal of Afrotopia is to plant seeds for radical imagination. And a lot of the work that we do in Afrotopia, we don't see the products of, we don't see the fruits, the labor, bear the fruits. We really just understand that it's the practice of planting seeds and creating these spaces for radical imagination, creating spaces for conversation, highlighting the work that's already been done, and knowing in good intention and good faith that it's creating a lot of positive impact. Though we often do, get told stories of, this was developed because I heard something happen at Afrotopia, or I met someone at Afrotopia, and now we've built this whole new space. So I just want to leave you all with a few tokens that I carry with me often of, it's always important to create space for imagination because it's manifestation. The more that you imagine, spend time designing and creating these visions, and understanding what it looks like and planning it all out, you really are manifesting it. And it's a really important practice, and that everything is fluid. In our educational model, we're often taught that you know, we have a chemistry building on this side of campus and we have a geography building on this side, and that there's no real relationship, but really there always is. And when we take a step back and look at pedagogy, look at the world, look at systems, and realize that there's so many facets within it, and we can use a lot of understandings from different spaces. In tandem, we create a lot of new and powerful understandings. So thank you. And I'm excited to go into conversation.
Thank you so much, Audie. Looks like we got some questions here if anyone else wants to type some in, but I'll try to tell you a few. See if we can get some conversation going. The first one I think I'm going to ask you is, someone wrote, what have you found to be the most surprising aspect of creating and fostering Afrotectopia?
Surprising aspect.
Is there anything unexpected that popped up, like that you never would have imagined through that process?
I think a lot of it I never would have imagined. I definitely never would have imagined that it would have gotten this far. I think I created it at the time as a student. I just wanted to create this event and see what would it be like to be in the middle of it. I definitely didn't expect, you know, 3 years later after first thinking about it, that I would still be building it out, and that it is still what was created back then. It still feels very much like a small prototype for, you know, much larger vision. So I think understanding, being able to realize that, you know, something that was affecting me was affecting so many other people on such a personal and deep scale has been, I think, one of the biggest, I guess, surprises.
Okay, great. And let's see. A couple of simpler questions that I think would be helpful for people possibly to mesh together would be, for those who are urgently looking for more people to follow, specifically those in the field of art and design who are focusing on Blackness. Are there any people right now that you are excited about that are actively making work?
And yeah, I think looking at if you go on Afrotopia's Instagram, you'll find, if you scroll down, you'll find a lot of the past presenters. I think looking into those people is automatically, you know, a really great start. People that I can think off the top of my head are, I think some of the most prominent voices are people like Stephanie Dinkins with AI and race, thinking very critically about AI race. There is Salome Asega, who has also worked a lot with Ayodemola Akunsende, who has a whole repository. It's called the IAPA repository. So they developed these inventions that, you know, tie specifically to Blackness in technology. There's Victor Dibia, who presented at the past Afrotopia Festival, who was creating a whole machine learning algorithm that would translate data into African masks. And I think that was one of my favorite projects that I've seen so far, because much of the, you know, Black experience has been severed from our cultural origins. And so to use technology to allow for those, you know, possibilities, reveal those possibilities of what would it be like if we had all of the artifacts that our, you know, culture had created. Those sorts of things really excite me. But yeah, I would definitely say go to Afrotopia's webpage, and you'll find, you know, past speakers for the School of Afrotopia, and scrolling down the Instagram.
Awesome. All right, cool. Thank you. And I think we have time for maybe one or two more. One question, maybe the first question was, how would you differentiate Afrotectopia from Afrofuturism to someone who is familiar with either terms or ideologies or movements?
Yeah, I really like this question, and I'm very appreciative of it, because I think Afrotectopia is often bottled into Afrofuturism, just, you know, pure assumptions. But Afrotopia really wasn't created. I created it really having not much understanding of Afrofuturism in general. And it was really about a practice of, I feel like in learning about Afrofuturism after Afrotectopia, developing it, Afrofuturism for me has been something that is much more about an aesthetic approach to work, of it's creating the sci-fi that is very intentional about placing Black bodies inside of the sci-fi, but with the way that I'm approaching futures design, speculative design, and studies, it's moving beyond aesthetics, it's moving even beyond theory, but it's really honing in on a practice of we're actually creating these spaces, we're creating solutions, and it's beyond, you know, literature and art. So I think that's the main difference of maybe Afrofuturism is thinking more about practice now, but from the way that I've studied it, it's been much more of an aesthetic and a theory, whereas Afrotopia is really about, you know, a pedagogy and a practice sort of approach.
Excellent. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Let's see. I think there's a lot of like anonymous questions, so it sounds like this is one from a student, so I think that would be cool. When you were first starting out, who did you look to help build and communicate your beliefs?
I didn't really have anyone to help me to communicate my beliefs. I think one way that I was experiencing my university graduate school experience was that I was, you know, getting a master's in creative technology, but that I was independently getting a master's in critical race theory. And I felt like I was doing that much on my own, of going to the library, reading a whole bunch of books, watching a whole bunch of talks, and really, you know, building up my political understanding, because I grew up as someone in a predominantly Black space, but it wasn't in a space where I was really being taught about politics. Like I grew up in a predominantly Black space, but still was never assigned to read any books by Black people growing up in school, you know, so it was just like a space that, you know, happened to be Black, but culturally and politically, we weren't thinking very specifically about Black. And it was also, you know, the Obama era, so we're thinking race is a bit different. So I really had to do a lot of that work myself and didn't have people to have those more immediate conversations. But I really gained those kind of mentors and community members after building Afrotopia, and then, you know, could do this kind of thinking in community.
Do you suggest like that students in a similar situation to what you were in do the same, or do you have any recommendations for them?
I think, I mean, now that you're even in this talk, you're aware of, you know, a whole community that exists that is already had done the work. I just didn't know of communities that were doing that. So I think now there's a lot more. I mean, now it's more, it's all over Instagram. At least it was all over Instagram a couple months ago, of just, you know, all the places to go to learn to read and all those sorts of things. So I think don't reinvent the wheel. Don't, you know, do things in silo. It's a lot more helpful to have a community of people that are doing this. But if you're not, you know, finding anyone in your immediate community that's interested in having these kind of conversations, then yeah, I think there's really no excuse to, you know, spend time and learn about critical race theory and politics in a racial oriented way.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time and coming to the College of Architecture and Design tonight to hang out and tell us about your work. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm happy to go until 8 if you want. I know we have until 8. I know there are a few questions.
Yeah, sure. We can talk a couple more. Let's see what you got. Let's see. Someone was curious about why you've gone back into the School of Architecture and what you're hoping to do there.
Yeah, I went back into the School of Architecture. The reason why I did that was because I had grown up loving architecture, and all the, you know, I grew up, that was just like the number one passion that I had as a kid, and always wanted to be one. And so I decided now that because I still wanted to be one, why not go back to school? But I actually just left architecture school because another feeling that I had, an inkling going into architecture school, was that it might not be the space that I want to learn in. And I think, you know, everyone has their own journey, but for me, being someone that has already dealt with so much in academia as far as a poor understanding of race and social context by my professors, I just didn't want to put myself in that experience again. And I found myself in a very similar space where I constantly had to be someone that was challenging the way that the curriculum was being taught and who we were considering and not considering. And I didn't feel like that was the best use of my energy. And I also felt like, you know, I mean, I hate to bring this up to so many architecture students, but I think that there are other ways to go about it. And I think the way that architecture is educated, for me personally, just felt very elitist. And I wanted to learn from people whose work I actually respected. And I really respect the work of, people that are on the continent of Africa, people that are in India, people that are in Thailand. I want to learn from those people. And I just didn't find those voices in the curriculum in my program. So I decided I want to, have a different approach to it.
Where do you think you're going to spend the majority of your energy then, now that you're going to have a lot more time? Is it will be developing Afrotectopia, that community more specifically?
Yeah, I'll definitely be spending more time developing Afrotopia, go back to working full time. I think it was also just, I had already had a master's degree. If I didn't have a master's degree and that was my graduate program experience, I probably would have approached it very differently and probably would have stayed, but I already have a degree. So now I more want to be, find people that I really respect and admire and be asked to be their apprentice and learn more in an old fashioned way.
This question kind of relates to your feelings about architecture school as well as what you just said, but can you see a way that the pedagogy of architectural education can be reframed in the way that you spoke of?
Absolutely. I think that's the thing that frustrated me so much, is just architecture has so much potential in the way that it's taught. It can really think a lot more about communities and about actual people and who's navigating through the space. I felt like the way that I was being taught was so arbitrary, and so much of, really putting the artist or architect or designer at the forefront and not really thinking about how, this space might feel, or, not using these different communities as like a blank canvas, but understanding that community has a whole, orientation, already set culture, and we really have to be respectful of that when we're entering and designing, a development side there. So yeah, I think architecture is always going to be something that I'm really excited about and fascinated with, and I just would rather learn it in a different setting. But I think for anyone that's in a university, I think there's so much room for architecture. I feel like architecture has always been a really incredible pedagogical framework, but I feel like right now, the way that it's being taught, it's a bit behind and outdated as far as it's not much room for flexibility. It's very rigid. So absolutely, I think there's plenty of potential.
This is another architecture question, but I think it's relevant. So based on what you know and your experience, are you thinking about ways that you can reimagine the built environment to address systematic racism?
Yeah, I'm thinking yes, in some ways, but I also don't want to tie all of my work into racial thinking in a very, traditional and specific way. I think that was also something that had me pretty burnt out in the middle of my graduate program of, I grew up, as I mentioned, as someone that loves art and just to create, and then to be in a space where I'm constantly thinking very in a traditional political way, it becomes very exhausting. And so not everything that I touch, I want to think about it in, specifically in a race way. I want to think about it in generally an ecological way and in a sentient way of there are cultural differences between people. How can we tap into that and make sure that's a space that's, sustainable for, all the people that we're thinking about that would be engaging at the space. Naturally, I'm always going to have a Black lens in whatever I'm doing, and, very intentional about making sure that, the people that I champion the most, Black people, that they're healthy and okay. But I'm also thinking about architecture outside of race and thinking about ecological frameworks of, how I was revisiting this idea of biomimicry, of how can architecture and the way that how we engage with architecture be in a biomimicratic form of, let's create structures that resemble the structure of, natural infrastructures, like the ways that trees stand up or the ways that, flowers sprout apart. How can we use those kind of technologies in the ways that we design technology and engineering and structural engineering? So also in those veins too. And then also fabrication, digital fabrication. How can we make sure, beyond using things like concrete or plastic filament, how can we create with natural material in the way that we fabricate digitally?
Awesome, yeah. All right, I think that this will be the last one as far as I can see. It's the most recent question. It says you talked a lot about not needing silos on a campus as large as ours at UT. What disciplines would you seek out? That maybe are less siloed, I guess, is what they're getting at.
Would I seek out? So not needing silos on a campus as large. Yeah, I mean, I think this is just the way that college campuses are, and it makes sense. It's not like a pure critique to, it's definitely not a pure critique to, this university. And it's not a pure critique to all universities. It's more of, what if we just didn't, divide them up in that way? I think personally, the ones that I would seek out are a lot of the ones that I alluded to in the presentation of, definitely technology, so that's computer science in a traditional way, but then also art and visual languages and design, and then architecture, and then biology with, biomimicratic orientations. I also really love studying the economy, public policy. So it would probably be the entire campus in one building. And it's really finding the relationship between all of them.
That's awesome. All right. Well, cool. It's really nice meeting you.
One or two more. Let's go for one or two more questions, Chris.
Okay. Yeah, sure. No. Okay. What is your recommendation as student and educator? How to recruit and retain students when they arrive and experience this same exhaustion that you've talked of, like when you get to school?
Yeah, I think it's not something I've personally dealt with. Like I honestly, in many of my classes, I maybe have one Black student, if that many.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that's just the spaces that I've been in as far as academia. But I am mindful of the students that I do have that are Black, that I see engaging with a lot of, this kind of like social justice work, and just make sure that they're taking care of themselves. It was so interesting when I was building Architectopia. One of the people that my program's faculty immediately introduced me to was a Black person in the university. And she was very hesitant about me taking on this work while being a student, because she has dealt with a lot of this of, being the one Black person in her environment, and that takes on all the diversity and inclusion work. And you just get burnt out doing all this work to fix the problems that you didn't create, but it consumes your life. And how it just is debilitating, and it takes so much agency and freedom for you to be, just a student that's interested in the medium that you came in to study. So when I see students that are exerting a lot of energy in social justice and race and diversity and all those sorts of things work, it's really just making sure that they're okay, that they're, coming to also receive the education that they came for, and that they're not solving all these problems that, it takes a lot of time and momentum to build out. So just really looking at them as a person and checking in with them. But it's really not a situation that I deal with too much as an educator because of the lack of racial diversity in the programs I'm in. But when it comes to recruiting, I mean, that's why, that's one of the reasons why I'm happy to do these sort of presentations, is because I grew up as someone that never saw, a Black person or Afro-Latin person doing this kind of work. And, just the ability to expose the work that I'm doing and the lens that I'm doing and the variety of other people that are doing it too, I think is really important, and it recruits in itself of people just being able to see themselves in this kind of work. So recruiting is really important to me.
Let's see if we can find another question. Some of these are comments, but sorry. Okay, here's a question. Lots of questions, actually. It's cool. Do you ever find yourself stuck between mainly focusing on the functionality or the abstract form of what you're creating? And if so, what is typically your process when you have to combine the two? I think I understand what you're saying. Like, it's like just like something that looks cool or something that's actually functional, I guess. But when you find yourself stuck between the two?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, I think more about what someone is going to gain. Sometimes I think more of like what's going to look like, and then I make it a tool. Or other times I think more about, like there's this one project that I built where I was merging climate data, and I was turning that climate data into sound. And I had no idea what it would look like, but I just knew that I wanted to merge these kind of different areas together. And I knew the technology I wanted to use, which was my modular synthesizer, to create the sound, and then output it in this new form. So there's never really a specific way. It all kind of ebbs and flows and feeds into each other. Generally, I always want it to look nice as a designer, and as an artist, I want it to be, I know that the visual experience is just as important as the experience that people are using and navigating through it. So I think it's something that happens in tandem always. They really feed into each other.
this is just a question I have actually about I think one of the first projects you had, your sound sculptures, or maybe other similar installations. It's the same question. Have you found, or have you like experimented with where you can place those outside of maybe like a gallery space and stuff, like in more public spaces?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I haven't thought about that, especially now. What does that mean? Like
Yeah, I
having
don't
a
know.
publicly interactive.
I mean, I was specifically interested in the physical ones, like in public space.
Yeah, I mean, in the
things like the
physical ones.
digital. Yeah.
Yeah, just like sanitization. That's like what I think about now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think one thing I think, I mean, I don't know. I never really thought of how it would be inside of a physical space. But it is something I think about a lot of just like museums. I do want more work inside of museums to be something I feel like that's a problem with museums. If it's so much of a bunch of monologues coming at you as a viewer, you just walk around and you just absorb whatever the artist intended for you to absorb or whatever you grasp from that work. And I think my work, I generally think about it in, challenging the museum kind of relationship with the viewer. Yeah, of it allowing, like if it were to exist in a museum, it would be a space where, it's an artist's work, original work, but the way that you engage with it, you create something entirely new. So that's how I would imagine it in a gallery of something that people can create their own work with.
Awesome. All right. I think with that, we're going to wrap it up, if that's all right.
Yeah.
It was really nice to meet you, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Bye.